Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everybody. Welcome to another session of the Dark Stoa. These are a weekly series where we actually practice our stoicism by contending with some of the scariest ideas that are going to affect humanity. We've covered things like CRISPR as art. Last week was on the robot war. And the week before was on how deep fakes will inflate the blackmail economy. And this week, I actually don't know exactly what we have in store, but right before the call, Pat was saying that as the pieces come together in this presentation, there will be a bit of a mindfuck moment at the end. The last slide is a bit of a mindfuck. So prepare for that. Let's hope all those years of reading Marcus Aurelius will pay off. So the structure for the evening, in a moment, I'm just going to hand it over to Pat and he's going to give us a presentation. And at the end of that, we'll open it up for questions. So throughout the presentation, I encourage everybody to pay close attention, get yourself propositionally ready for the mindfuck moment, but also make note of the parts where you disagree or you feel confused and bring those questions to the Q&A and we'll have a wonderful dialogue. And without further ado, I bring you Pat Ryan.
Howdy, folks. Welcome back to another scenario of, wow, this is probably not going to end well. This particular one is called Autocults. As again, I tend to use words that are already well loaded, and then I fight you and say that create one more definition. So this has been the ongoing series about the blackmail inflation economy. Last week, we observed what Game A is most likely to do, that centralized power sociopath thing, where it will most likely tip over into robotic nationalism. Game B, which is coined by Jordan Greenhall, he is trying to, as best as I understand this, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, and it's always open for negotiation, but what I think he's trying to do is find epistemic vaccines or epistemic antibiotics, where you have this explosion of different belief systems that just intrinsically do not cohere. And he's either trying to find a path through it, or he's trying to give you the tools and the means to carve your own paths through it. So that's incredibly useful in the upcoming crazy that's upon us. But there might be an unintended consequence to that. And so Autocults is going to explore what that unintended consequence might be, and at the very minimum, at least to put a shape around it. So I'm now going to share my screen and let us begin. Boop. Boop. Okay, get my laser. Okay, here's binary Jesus. So game B, Autocults. Here we go. So again, we looked at what happened in the blackmail economy, or the blackmail inflation scenario. We've explored the really bad things that we really don't want. And then we're starting to explore the things that might be the best thing we can hope for, in the sense that at least it's manageable. You might not agree with a robot war, but I explained how you can at least turn it into something manageable. And when it comes to epistemic conflict, I'm now going to proceed to explore what it means to make that manageable. So we're going to go into a fully automated cult creation. I'm going to ask you to suspend your definition of what you think a cult is, because I'm going to give a really specific definition of it later on. Okay. So as I always do, I like to start at the beginning. So this is Democritus, the laughing philosopher, and he was the person who came up with the idea of atomic fate. Sorry, there we go. So, much better. So he came up with the idea of atoms and the void being the only constituents of reality. Or maybe he didn't come up with it, but he certainly expounded upon it in great detail, stating that all that exists is the atom and the void, and everything else is a convention of those constituents. And that's roughly where we're at with the scientific methodology. So go Democritus. Not a bad idea you got there. So we start with an atomic unit, one of these indivisible concepts. That's what atom means in Greek, I believe. You have this atomic indivisible. It's in a current state. It's made up of certain properties at a certain time. We then transmute it with an action to a different state. So we modify some of the properties and we get a different state. And we've already explored infinitesimal and time symmetry and that sort of thing. So you can merge those two things together. So he said this fundamental action is the driver of the entire universe. And he's not too far off. It's not bad for, Bronze Age. But then there's a change of things. A guy named Epicurus comes along, and he does the Stoic wiggle. And what that means is when you take the the consequences of Democritus and you say, well, it's only it's only atoms and transmutations, then what you're talking about is fate. You're talking fatalism. You're talking a mechanical precision of the universe rolling out in exactly the sequence that's replayable under every possible, no matter what the conditions are. So this, if I throw this thing over here, there were forces that made that happen. As I threw that right into my water, there were forces that made that happen. And I couldn't stop it. So the initial action is a cause, which then causes an effect. And there's no interpretation, no other possible outcome that could have been. And that was the natural takeaway of Democritus's interpretation of the universe. But then Epicurus comes along and says, well, there might be more going on behind the scenes than that. And he breaks it apart into like 3 high-level umbrella concepts, happening by necessity, which is what Democritus was talking about, and others by chance, which is randomness, effectively. The idea that maybe the atoms aren't going, and maybe there's like some quantum wiggle going on. And then through our own agency, which is where this birth of free will gets its start, is right here, through our own agency. So we have the machine, we have the weird, and then we have ourselves. And this is where a lot of philosophical dispute really originates from. So same concept, we have our atomic unit. He called it swerve, by the way, like a rapper, I don't know, but like a swervy transmutation action, and you'll end up with a potential state. So he's laying the groundwork for an early concept of quantum physics, effectively. And so these two people kind of duke it out in the free will argument throughout, I don't know, probably the next 2,000 years. It's either mechanical, or maybe there's some other things that we can't see, or an invisible hand, or we come up with these really rough heuristics throughout the history of philosophy. And these guys really double down on Democritus. So they're part of the Free Will is Stupid Club. So Democritus was, he's basically saying, well, everything's a machine and everything's ticking correctly. Hobbes comes along and just hates people. He comes up with the concept of Leviathan and says you need this strong central leader to control this mechanical machine so that everything does happen in a fatalistic disposition. Pavlov comes along and changes the game entirely, and he says not only is free will doesn't exist, but I can program it. And he does it with dogs in terms of, just making them ring the bell and they slobber all over the place and you got to clean it up and it's a mess. But he was able to say, well, free will is now programmable. So is it even free to begin with? This is where things go off the rails. So these old philosophical discussions about, free will or fatalism, this guy comes along and blows all that out the water, because now we have a new player in the game, and that is our own neurology. And that is beyond our own reasoning skills. And that sounds very strange to say that our brain is beyond our reasoning skills, because our reasoning comes from our brain. But I simply channel a quote by a person who I don't remember. But the quote is, if our brain was so simple we could understand it, we would be so simple we couldn't. And so Pavlov comes along and really throws that on his head. And then this guy comes along, Delgado, and he's not, unless you're really in the psychotechnology space and the history of it, you probably never heard of this guy. Delgado takes Pavlov and puts it on crack. Pavlov relies on repetition, a lot of repetition, in order to get the behavior you're looking for. Delgado straight up electrocuted the brain to get the behavior you're looking for. So he would isolate a specific neuron cluster and go zap, and then you would act. And you've probably seen a lot of that stuff from like the 1950s, like electroshock therapy, for example. Yeah, this guy is like the king of that whole realm of psychological analysis. And on the inverse of this side, because people did see, and to back up, Hobbes right here, people saw the terrifying conclusion of what he was saying with the what was later derided as the Leviathan. If there is to be a central force, then who plays the Godhead? And that's always an uncomfortable conversation. Is it going to be you? Is it going to be me? I always think of another quote where it's like, if we have data, we shall follow the data. If all we have are opinions, we shall follow me. And that's what Hobbes was effectively promoting. So this would naturally spawn that, hey, if free will is stupid, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. Free will exists, and I'm going to prove it by being as badass rebel as I can come up with. So this is Locke, and he basically writes pretty good research on why rulers are not an authority. That sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. But he has some good ideas. But the thing you got to remember about Locke is that he is born from the 30 Years' War, which I keep referencing in all these other talks that I'm doing. From the 30 Years' War, he saw the abuse of Hobbes' system. He saw the papal authority as the pinnacle of what Hobbes was promoting. And because of the destructiveness of the 30 Years' War, he would later go on and embrace a concept called tabula rasa, the blank slate. The idea where you are not born with all the properties you have and you're just going through the machine fate of your life. You are a blank slate that can be reprogrammed, or you're a blank slate that can choose your own outcomes, or you can do that Epicurus swervy stuff for your own life. And he runs with this primarily as a argument against papal authority, saying divine will doesn't dictate everything that's happening to us here. We have some agency on our own lives, you know. And this is a refreshing argument after 30 years of religious conflict. So he gets embraced, and again, he was the founding father's founding father. So almost all of America's legal doctrine and spirit behind it comes from this guy. And the basis is rulers are not an authority. And you see that in the American Constitution, which is built entirely to constrain federal government. That was the purpose of the Constitution. So then we move on to this guy. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Arthur Schopenhauer is, if I'm mangling that, just make fun of me. Schopenhauer should have been the end of philosophy, in my opinion. I don't like putting opinions out there without backing it, but I'm going to do that because I think he should have been the end of philosophy. This conclusion is what he alludes to, that human cognition is not an authority. That's like, well, hold on. wait, I have a brain and it's sensing the world. So how can I not be an authority of my own world that I'm sensing? Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And he's turning around and saying, well, nah, not really. You can't trust human cognition. And he explains his reasoning in a construct that I will reveal at a later time. Wittgenstein, I think that's Wittgenstein. This guy wants to deconstruct all of philosophy effectively. After World War II, the Europeans had butchered each other so horribly between World War I and World War II that disillusion of all things European set in, no kidding. And this guy was out there saying history is not an authority, philosophy is not an authority. Everything we've been doing up to this point cannot be cited or referenced at all. We have royally screwed everything up. And so history is not an authority. And then you get Pollack, who is an artist who was funded by the CIA, and he says art's not an authority, and watch this, I'm just going to spray paint everywhere. So all this aesthetics and beauty that you're trying to use to justify history, that you're then trying to use to justify rulers, guess what? That's not an authority either. And then Derrida comes along and says language is an authority. So the very tool you're using to communicate also isn't an authority. So we're getting more and more atomic in our ability to rebel, and it's becoming more and more nonsensical to the point where you can't even, if nothing's an authority, and then I'm not an authority, do I even exist? Like it's almost like this inversion of free will to the point that the only way you can defend free will is to pretend you're not even existing, like this weird paradox where I'm an agent, but I'm not an agent. So I tend to lump all this stuff together as classist fuckery. This is all just a bunch of overeducated, I'm going to be as deriding as possible here. These are a bunch of overeducated people, with probably the exception of this guy. Probably. And this guy was willing to do the hard work. I'll give him that. He did the hard work, but in the end, it's still classist fuckery. It's still, here's power, here's our ability to rebel against power, and it's just showing itself at different periods of time, at different cultures. So I just lump it all together as classist fuckery. This guy, OG useful insights. Absolutely OG useful, because human cognition is not an authority is the actual legit argument through this whole thing. It's independent of class. It's independent of context and history. It's outside of human cognition. That's literally everything he was saying there. And what did he define this as? Oh no, he comes in and says, is it, I gotta let someone in. Is it possible to demonstrate human free will from self-consciousness? That's a great question, because that's what these guys are. If you think of these anti-authority as a scatter plot, like they're circling this concept about free will and self-consciousness. For a long time, it's very native to assume these two things are inseparable. But he comes along and says, no, wait a second. There might be this thing called nomenon. Nomenon. So he basically says the world of representation doesn't always overlap with the world as will. Those are terminologies from his time. The world as representation is the Democritus idea, where atoms exist and everything is derivative of those atoms. So things are being represented from those fundamentals. And then the world as will, as in our cognition of that representation, which isn't the representation. So he's making a clear distinction between the two. And he's saying that if we make this distinction, there is going to be stuff that is outside of both. And I think that is so overlooked when it comes to talking about free will. And when you merge this concept of things that are outside of human cognition with what we just explored about the brain being outside of human cognition, he might have been talking about psychotechnology and didn't even know it. So let's see if we can bind this together, this kind of weird insight that I'm trying to drive home. Let me move my screeny screen. So I had mentioned Delgado in the past, and this is what made him famous in, I think, 63. It's a fighting bull in Spain, and they're pretty agitated. You might have seen them at some point in your life, and pretty aggressive animals. They're trained to be aggressive. They're designed, their whole lives they're abused. Their whole lives are treated like shit so they can enhance the aggressive capabilities. What this guy did is he installed it's called a stimaceiver, he called it, where you install this electrode control on the brain, and it was powered by a remote knob. So you would amplify the electricity that would then target this part of the brain. And upon doing so, this bull charged him. He turned on the radio control, and the bull just whoop went around the other way. Just like whoop, just 360 degrees, just bounced, right? So you see like these, like, I'm a bull, I'm charging you. Oh my God, wait, no, I've changed my mind. Right? So he just, you see him press the button pretty furiously here as he's shitting himself. And so this rocked the world. And it's funny that this stuff is not taught in common education, because this was, I mean, maybe we bake it in our sci-fi so much that you just don't teach it that way anymore. But this altered everything, because now we were no longer talking about philosophy. We were talking about the mechanization of the brain itself. So instead of having free will, you could program the brain of other people. I could use my free will to remove yours with button pressing. And not just for bulls, he would also do it to people. So he was able to induce like fear, rage, lust, hilarity. I don't even know what that is. Other reactions, all kinds of stuff, just by poking the brain. And here, one example, usually when you do open brain surgery on someone, it's good for them to do something that's cognitively important. So if you make a incorrect cut and they fuck up, then you fucked up, because otherwise how could you possibly know? So in this case, she was playing a guitar, and he shocked a specific part of the brain, and she just went nuts, just smashed her guitar. And she would later describe it as, I don't know why I did that. But why the fuck, like, it's like, why did I do that? It's almost, he was completely robbed of will. And that's a complicated action. I mean, run through the cascade of that electroshock brain. Oh, I'm going to stop playing music. I'm going to furrow my face. I'm going to move my right arm around this thing. I'm going to swing this over my head. I'm going to smash it. That's like 10,000 different complex behaviors in one sequence. And that was invoked by a single shock. So clearly we've stepped into a totally different way of understanding human psychology, which in turn has huge ramifications on how we should approach philosophy. And again, Delgado was a rock star at this time, all the way up to 1970. Even the headline New York Times, what kind of humans would we like to construct? I mean, just think about that, right? Construct a human. We're going to take Pavlov, we're going to take Hobbes, and we're going to construct a human by controlling what electronic stimulation is happening in their brain to teach them or otherwise control them or otherwise program them, as we use in brainwashing, as we call it today. And just to demonstrate even more how precise he was getting, it wasn't just like shock and, oh, that's kind of funny. He was getting precise. He would do monkeys, for example. In this case, he would shock the monkey, which is a hilarious 1980s song. And the result was that you would get the monkey to climb a pole, jump down, growl, threaten, attack another monkey, then change attitude and approach the rest of the group in a friendly way. So I'd just be like, I'm jumping up there. I'm down here. Fuck you. Hey, everybody. You would do, like shock. One shock, you'd get that complicated chain of behavior. And no matter how many times you shocked that brain, it would repeat that complicated chain of behavior 20,000 times in a row. Is there free will? Under those conditions, can you even begin to argue free will anymore? It's complicated. It's tough. Because you see this, that's a wildly complicated chain of events. And it's repeatable like a machine, press button, monkey does thing. So what's going on here? How did he get here, right? Because you could shock a brain and like a behavior happens. All right, okay, mad scientist shit, but how do you get refined control? How do you get higher resolution and better, more predictability out of this process? I'm hitting you with an electric charge. And if I'm monitoring your brain with like, I don't know, some type of proto-EEG at that time, it's going to look like this. Your brain is constantly just lots of signal, lots of electrochemical interaction going on all the time. It's going to look like this. So if I add this tiny little sine wave to this mess, I'm just going to get more mess. I'm going to have no idea what I'm actually doing here. I have to be able to tease this thing, the result of this thing from this noise, and by default, you just can't do that. It's too much crazy going on. It's almost like, I don't know, like think of a lottery ball machine and you throw your own ball in there and you're trying to figure out how is that going to affect the interaction of all the other balls. It's too much noise. So let's play with some technology here. So this is called the Wiener-Chinchen theorem. This is a way to perform a Fourier transformation to turn this mess into something more manageable. And then this particular machine is called a homeostat. This is like from 1948. A British person whose name escapes me, but he was able to take 4 bomb fins that would autocorrect in the pre-bombing days. Usually they just like drop bombs and hope for the best. But they would find ways to stabilize the fin as it went down to increase the accuracy of the bomb. And that auto stabilization system, when you wired it up to 4 of themselves, what they would do is they would naturally achieve an equilibrium no matter what complicated noise you throw into it. So no matter what electric signal you threw into this thing, it would then be able to say, okay, we can find the equilibrium between all the peaks, the troughs, the distributions, and we can now reflect a signal that would counter this signal. This was touted as an artificial brain by 1948 because it was naturally finding equilibrium in these complex noises. So when you merge these things together, this theorem and this machine, what you're able to do is you're able to tease out the effects of your input from the noise with this process. So if I put in this bolt, it's going to go through this noise, and I no longer have to look at the behavior. So now I can start doing micro behaviors, shit that doesn't even present to you. I can start affecting your thoughts, things that wouldn't actually demonstrate as, physical behavior like I'm doing now. I hit here, I'm able to tease out the result of my input and then find the output of it in this mess, and I don't even need to see your behavior anymore. I can now get down to the individual transformation of the math itself. You're just a meat puppet at this point. I don't care if you're behaving. I can actually find the result of my experimentation. So this rapidly expanded this psychotechnological exploration considerably. This was a very revolutionary thing. And this led to the concept of the autocorrelator, which is the combination of that theorem and the homeostat. And this was also led to, what do we got here? Right, so let's zoom in on this part here, right? So the autocorrelator was able to do exactly that thing where you're teasing out the input and you're able to correlate the input and the output through noise, which is revolutionary. And again, we'll be able, so in this case, finding no correlation in the random noise component at the longer delay time. So it's not just like instant, right? It's not just like I shocked here and then I instantly see the result here. Sometimes the brain takes time, 200 milliseconds, maybe 5 seconds, who knows? In this case, for longer delay times, you could use an autocorrelator to then say the input was here, the output was here, and we can get an extreme faithfulness of that correlation. So now we can do long-term behavior as well, not just the instant stuff. Not just so you can almost get Pavlovian here. Excuse me. And this has a technique over narrow band filters. So you take when you have that noise, you apply a very narrow band filter, which is going to be a high pass, a low pass, a Q pass, the means of filtering out all the other frequencies just so you can focus on this one little tiny narrow band. But that's only so useful because the brain is constantly doing these correlations, and you need to do it. You need to find correlations in that natural complexity. You can't just like look at this, like you can't peek into this little band and be like, oh, is this it? You need to see the whole thing. And so this machine was able to do that. So now let's correlate this stuff to the complicated behavior because we have the technology. I just walked you through the technology that can do this. So we take our input, put it in the brain, pick a spot of the brain, whatever. Take our autocorrelators, and then poof, now we have signal-driven, reproducible behavior, just like the monkeys. Now we can fine-tune your behavior, by the way, from these signals, these input signals. We can set up complicated chains of Pavlovian training from this input. So how do you do all that? Well, we take stimuli, and not just anywhere. It's not just stimuli on the brain wherever. Parts of the brain matter. If I'm affecting, your olfactory glands, if I'm affecting your sense of balance, your ability to detect emotion, for example, all of these are stimuli. Any type of energetic input can count as stimuli. So even if I leave my brain out of it, if I leave my electrode out of my brain, I'm just talking about a human body, I have plenty of stimulus energy sources constantly hitting my body at all hours of the day, every second. And what it does is it kind of creates this behavioral tree. So if a stimuli of a foul-smelling pile of trash comes across my way, my behavior tree, which is going to show all of my most likely options according to that stimuli scenario, maybe it goes here and says, oh, trash, there's a high probability I'm going to walk away from it. So if I map all of these actions together and go down the tree, a stimuli can be mapped in a behavior tree with probabilistic distribution and all that stuff. I'm not talking in terms of like mathematical exacts here. It's like 60% chance or whatever. Now, how do I modify that behavior tree? that complicated possible chain of outcomes that you, a human, are going to engage in based upon the stimuli you're experiencing. Well, I can use repetition. That's what Pavlov did. And you might have noticed something disappeared up here and down here. So what I've done is I've narrowed the behavior tree. So now your range of actions have been reduced. What if I had drugs? In psychopharmacology, for example. Oh, I got a whole new branch of action over here. That wasn't even possible before. Then what if I make it feedback? What if my behavior tree modification feeds back, determines the stimulus I receive, which then modifies my behavior tree further? Uh-oh. Now we got a problem. Now what we have is a situation where you get repetition, discipline, or straight up mind control, where I have narrowed your option tree down so tightly that you will do this behavior over and over again as if I shocked you, just like that monkey, at that specific neuron. And I don't need installations in your head to achieve this outcome. I don't need that. Oh, and by the way, these behavior trees, they're coarse equivalents to neural pathways. Oh my God. Hello, Elon Musk. Oh, you're here because of Neuralink. That's so weird. All right. Yeah, I mean, it is expensive. You got to install it. You got to cut open the scalp, or maybe you got to put a thing here, and you can modify these pathways and then in turn modify the behavior tree. But man, that's expensive. Last I checked Neuralink, they had problems with the body rejecting a long-term installed solution here. So he's trying to control the behavior tree of people, and this is a diffusion tensor image of these brain pathways. But this is expensive, as we said. The Neuralink and these Delgado's solutions and all these stuff that we want to do to modify the brain, that's like surgery, that's medical bills, that's a mess. I mean, that's a big, big overhead. So what if there's another way to do all this? What if you don't need surgery to do all this stuff? That would be easier. That would be much cheaper, in fact. And you could roll it out at scale. So you wouldn't just be modifying the behavior tree of your current patient. You can modify the behavior tree of 1 million people at the same time, using all of these tricks that I'm talking about. But how do you do that without surgery? That's the missing piece, right? Well, it was missing until the 70s. Semiotics. Don't know if you guys understand semiotics. Semiotics is the study of language as a signal. It's probably the easiest way to describe it. So typically when we think language, we're like song and tone and the foments and the voices and all the stuff that we use to convey meaning. We're conveying meaningful symbols with our organic language that we've derived. But that's not the only thing that language has. Language can be reduced to mere semiotic signal, which has no meaning whatsoever. It could be utter noise, it could be bebop, it could be anything. It's sonic energy at the end of the day. That's all it is. So if I'm saying something, it's because my throat is vibrating 2,000 times a second, and it's modifying the air on its way out of my lungs. My tongue and then my mouth is also shaping it further, and then it's coming out of my mouth, and then it's entering your ear, in which you have this this very complicated pinna, which is filtering off your high frequency audio, goes into the I forget the name of it, but it reduces it automatically by 10 decibels. Then it hits your tympanic membrane, which then vibrates these 10 sacs in your ear, which have neural hairs in them, right? So I've just described the neural process of language. I've removed the symbols of the words themselves, and I've reduced them to semiotic signals, to sonic energy, as if it was an electrode hitting your brain. Now, why target language in particular? That's neurolinguistics. Language, Brokaw's area, is the magic sauce, because I can hit you with a symbol, with a word, and your entire body's going to vibrate if I do it right. So it's as if I hit you with an electric shock. Same stuff. I could say a handful of words right here, right now, and you're going to fly off the handle. I could drop, I don't know, racial slurs or something, and most of y'all would quit right now, right? Well, that's the power of language. I can make you do complicated things as if I shocked your brain. So semiotics became this huge part of trying to do the psychotechnological research, which surprisingly, all this stuff suddenly becomes classified once that realization's made. How strange. Oh, and look, we have a scientific basis for Jacques Derrida, the destruction of language. There is nothing beyond the text. So we have a philosopher who's looking at all this stuff and saying, yeah, I can use this science for my basis. That's easy enough. We can destroy the meaning behind the symbols and look at the sonic energy exclusively behind it to get the same exact behavior. And we don't need to teach you complicated words or anything like that. We can hit you with like, I don't know, like random noise and we can roughly get the same solution. So now let's go back to our chart, and instead of looking at like this stimuli, let's look at symbolic conveyance going to the brain, going to the autocorrelator, which is now still technically single driven reproducible behavior. But I don't need an electrode in your head anymore. I can do it with just words. And that's just more than words too. It's symbolic conveyance. So, advertising exploits this all the time. Voice acting, cutaways in movies, for example. Genreification of music was a huge part of semiotic research because people would intentionally self-filter for certain sonic preferences that they basically self-selected to be manipulated by. Hip-hop in particular was notorious for linguistic preference. Rock music was notorious for just loud, shake your soul type stuff. Everybody filtered along the genres to condition themselves for semiotic research. Quantized memetics, for example, we've seen that in Chans all day long, and all of this leads to digitizing identity. So what we're doing is we're taking our semiotic responsiveness and we're creating individual units of a personality so a computer can now make sense of it, which of course is leading us to the shit show that we're in right now. But what if I change my ancient technology of autocorrelators to neural networks? Uh-oh. Remember that thing I did about the morality machine? A couple slides back, couple videos back? Where am I going with this? So I promised I would give you a different definition of cults. I am of the opinion that cults are behavioral state machines. So a state machine is just like a behavior tree, but a state machine will account for all possible state transitions between each node. So you can have a complicated tree, but sometimes those nodes, they don't just go through a tree. What they'll do is they'll sometimes refer back to themselves, or they'll sometimes have a relationship where they're going back and forth all the time. So that's a state machine, and a cult is basically, instead of a behavior tree, it's a behavior state machine. It's, I'll probably have a lot of Q&A questions about how to break that down. So let me just keep going. So remember, we have our behavior tree, but a state machine is made up of the transition between trees. So we have our set of behavior trees here. And we say this is state 1 for the behavior tree, this is state 2 for the behavior tree, and we're moving through these states just like when we shock that monkey, where it goes through behaviors tree 1, then it moves, jumps up the hill, or jumps up the pole, jumps down the pole, gets angry. Now it's friendly, right? So we're looking at the state machine transition between behavior. And we're doing this with symbolic conveyance alone. The great orator, the great preacher, the person who can command the audience with the best possible sonic presence, that type of stuff. Symbolic conveyance doing all of these things because our brains evolved Brokaw's area. So we've set ourselves up for semiotic manipulation for all of time. And just to really drive home, what's a trigger word, right? Well, congratulations, you've been semiotically programmed. Remember, the automatism was repeated in the same order each time through 20,000 sequential stimulations. Now, you might think you have free will and say, well, that wouldn't happen to me. Yeah? Spell the rest of that word out and tell me how it goes. You've been semiotically programmed. So let's run this through. We now understand that a cult is a transformation of behavioral trees over time. So we have our behavioral tree here, and we have the cult of the smiling Bob. He's just doing his thing. Now we have the cult of the Azure Sun, which sounds way too RPG. And what they're doing is they're competing for the brain space of entire populations. This is basically advertising. You know, cult of the Smiling Bob, these people like it. And cult of the Azure Sun, these people like it. Now, to basic, mathematical representation, this is easy to reason about, but what if this happens? What if they like the Smiling Bob and Azure Sun? What if they don't like each other? The point I'm trying to make here is that these brains, they are the fabric of cult space-time, which is probably way too complicated of a way to say this, but think of each brain as a vertex on an XY grid. And what you're doing is I'm putting this symbolic conveyance of Bob on that XY grid to change its excitation. So it's either going up or it's going down or whatever, right? So the brain space here is the only area that cults recognize. They don't recognize individuals. They recognize how they're causing excitation on the fabric of psychology itself. That's an important concept to wrap your head around. No pun intended. The idea is that our social networks, our relationships between one another, our ways to convey a meme to one another or an idea to one another, that is a fabric no different than space itself. There's a time delay to move from one point to another, just like normal space. There's excitation about the ability to hold that position, just like space. There's even quantum fluctuations, like stuff like this, where two things collide together and you don't know how it's going to turn out, just like space. So space-time as an analog for how psychology of populations works holds up pretty well when you start treating cults like behavioral state machines. So this leads us to the autocult. Once we understand that these cults are fighting for human resources, and the reason they're fighting for these human resources, it's the same way we fight for land. If I'm claiming land way out there, it's because I want the future promise of what that land is potentially worth. Maybe there's oil under it. Maybe there's farms on it. Maybe I can turn it into something of value. Well, cults see humans the same way. They see, I got to claim as many people as I can with my first round of memes because that human is valuable later on. And it's also currently valuable. Maybe it's paying me for this, or maybe I need to shape that human into something else. So that competition leads to the autocult. And how is an autocult born? Well, we start with the filter bubble, where you're on your machine, you're doing your personalized data. There is a brain simulacrum somewhere scattered across multiple AIs in some corporate warehouse somewhere, data center somewhere. That is then making decisions to figure out what ads it shows you in your little bubble. It could also be memes or videos or events content. It doesn't have to be ads, but ads tend to take this form. It's basically, here's the data coming out. How can I poke you so that you can send me more of this? How can I poke you so that you can send me more of this? Look at that. We've created a behavioral state machine. Just like that. If I hit you with this, come back. Oh, okay. When I do this, then I get this transformation, then I get this transformation, just like the monkey with the shock. Oh, wow, look at that. Now, if I throw a morality machine on top of it, well, now I have an autocult. I just built an autocult. So my morality machine is that construct I was talking about in the prior video. And for those who haven't seen it, let me briefly go over it. Morality machine is where you are taking that filter bubble and you are fully automating it. And you are eliminating realities because you fully automated it. So there's only so much about reality you're capable of seeing when you're under the influence of one of these morality machines. You're not going to see the whole of reality at all. It's going to consistently reinforce itself, and it's going to optimize. And this is where things get a little bit different. It sounds like targeted ads, but where it changes is that targeted ads are trying to maximize for attention. Morality machines are trying to maximize for X. And that X could be anything. It could be, I'm optimizing for people who like candy canes. I'm optimizing for people who can do jumping jacks. I'm optimizing for people who are overweight. Whatever it is the morality machine is selecting for, you can start building these autonomous Well, this thing is autonomous and it's driving the behavioral transformation. It's creating a cult and it's autonomously maintaining it. And it's not just selecting for attention and it's not just selecting for profit. It's selecting for any goddamn moral thing you can think of. And that is an autocult. And autocults also compete for cult space-time. So here's the autocult of Keck. Throwing his little Pepe meme everywhere. Look at that. Go Pepe. That in turn is creating an autocult of no Pepe, please. And so it's hitting all these things, right? And saying, no Pepe there, that's racist, right? So then let me back up a bit. Oh, yeah, sorry. So this guy is able to crack all these uncolonized brains, but the Pepe brains are there, and you gotta get that Pepe out of there. That's just mean. So how do we do it? Well, we can't do it because these slots are already occupied. So what do? Well, the autocult itself isn't sufficient. I need to start leveraging human psychology. I need to start using neurolinguistics. Ooh, I can use neurolinguistics to now erase what other autocults have done. So now these autocults, what they're going to do is that they're going to increasingly take psychology and make it AI compliant so that they can compete the best for this cult space-time fabric. Now, when an autocult is no longer able to command the neural resources of a person and thus make them do work and thus feed them profit, well, the autocult dies. Even autocults naturally select for each other. So where does this go? The problem is that when these autocults are fighting for human brains, you'll never know. And the reason you'll never know is because their fight for your brain looks like epistemic conflict. So when you say like, oh, that person's a conspiracy theory, or when you say, oh, that person's an X or that person's a Y, right? That epistemic conflict, how do you not know this, right? Why do you watch Fox News? Your knowledge is missing. You're stupid. You're this, you're that, right? That epistemic conflict that we're all embroiled in. Autocults will masquerade as that, and you will never know. Because they're playing the same exact game as the epistemic conflict game. So let me walk you through an example. Epistemic is an autocult of the smiling Bob. It's taking up this part of a brain, and they have the green heart taking this one. You have the blue triangle cult taking this one. You have your moon taking that one. You have your cult of the weird can here. It's like an angry bowl of Lucky Charms fighting for your brain. And you will not know these players exist because what they're doing is that they are appealing to your psychology so that you engage in this, so that you fight these other things that you don't know exist. And so let me do one more click to tie it all together. You start to think in terms of these autocults without ever knowing they exist. You see all of reality along the lines of how these things are interacting with. So this is an abstract I've been giving. Let's make it real. If I was turning any one of these brands into an autocult and they were fighting for your brain, you wouldn't even know. You wouldn't even see it as that. You wouldn't even dawn on you to think that an AI was fighting for your brain and other AIs were competing for your brain. Wouldn't even dawn on you. You would think it epistemic conflict. I'm the smart one, right? I know everything. I know everything. No, I know everything. No, I know everything. Doesn't even look like autocults fighting for your brain. And oh, by the way, that person is thinking in terms of reality, like this, with these little cult symbols. So here's where things get messy. And here's where Game B tries to do the right thing and it might fuck up. So Game B is trying to create these epistemic vaccines against autocults, but this creates what's called a super cult. That sounds like a ludicrous word, like Superman, cult jumps in a phone booth and it comes, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, just like antibiotics create superbugs, anti-mimetics will create super cults. How can that be? Remember, these cults are fighting for your brain. You'll never see them, but they're fighting for you, and cults can kill each other. So congratulations, Islam took Coca-Cola. go Muhammad, right? And then, oh, look, Democrats took over this one, right? Oh, look, Republicans took that. It's not enough to simply destroy. Like, you can't actually destroy the residual effects of the auto cult in the living population. You can destroy the machine behind it and the profit motive behind it, but all the memes are still there. They're all still floating in the wild. So all of these ideas you've accumulated by subscribing to these cults, well, they're still in your brain. So we're not gonna forcibly terminate you because of that. No, we're gonna hijack all those memes and we're gonna force it in our auto cult pile. And we're going to enhance our ability to control more and more people. And then eventually, the super cult appears, which controls all memes and controls all contexts and all of how reality could possibly be perceived. So if you go wild on the epistemic vaccines, you might end up here. You got to be real careful with that. And game B, if they decide to rejigger the Pareto frontier, they might buy time. I'm not so sure. I think this is a natural conclusion when you start reaching for the epistemic penicillin. So this is all fun theoretical stuff that I've been talking about and pretty hilarious extrapolations. Let's give you a living example of how to do this. We're going to automate astrology. Here's our nice little hippie girl. And she's constantly having behaviors emitted, and it's being collected either by IoT or phones or anything else. And eventually you start to, if you collect enough of that data, you can actually kind of guess how a person's thinking. Like maybe when you're sitting down and you move a certain way, your phone accelerometers betray that, and some AI picks up and says, oh, that person's making that move. They must be thinking about if their action is aligned with the stars. Okay, what's wrong with that? It's on the phone. You know, it's collecting all the metadata, the sentiment, social networks, psychometrics, blah, blah, blah. Now, what we have is the concept of astrology is an interface for the astrology morality machine. It's an interface. So this is like, here's how humans look at it, and they have a mystic connection with it, or they're examining it, or they're being a part of this thing, and they're using it as a proxy to understand reality. That's just an interface for this thing. This is the actual machine making the assessments about what astrology is going to be. So in this case, because astrology, I picked astrology first because it's uniquely time-based in its predictions. And it has a heuristic categorization. So your categorizations are obviously zodiac signs, and your time-based prediction is where are these things going to be in the future and how's that going to affect your mood. The whole damn thing is built for AI. It's unbelievably compatible with it. So what does this do? Well, this then says, well, we can now ship this out to other people who are receptive to this idea in the social network using controlled, timed, measured symbolic conveyance. And what it's going to do is it's going to make the network acknowledge that someone in their network has the divine with them. How does that look? How is that even possible? Damn, girl, charts are aligned for you. Well, the AI presented reality to these guys, who then made them in turn acknowledge that this person, the stars are in their favor. So this person is able to get social proof, social verification that her belief in this is now true. Oh my God, I am aligned. You're biasing the behavior tree towards specific branches. Now I pick on astrology first because it just happens to work so well with AI. Do it to Christianity. Do it to Islam. What if the world just couldn't stop producing these auto cults? What if you have weird cults where I'm going to worship this lemon on Tuesday because when I do that, that's when the Amazon drone delivers the banana I want? There's nothing stopping that. And you have to use VPNs as a vaccine against these things. So, so that's it. That's the Autocult. Thank you for listening to this wild, wacky journey.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Pat. At this point, everybody just prepare your questions. If you're confused about anything, I know I'm confused about some of what went on there. Feel free to ask questions for clarification. I'm going to start by asking Pat some of my questions while Everybody can throw some in the chat, and then I'll start to read them. Or I can ask you to unmute yourself and you can read them yourself. All right. So I guess like the first obvious question was, how do you, like, I'm sure you thought of this, but how do you frame your framing of this whole autocult phenomena within the story of the autocult? Like how are you not just a product of this at just some higher meta level that's like talking about autocults? I see you as a somewhat embattled person who's engaging with a series of different debates on all these different sides, and perhaps throughout that process you've developed this emergent perspective of autocults. And how are you exempt from that, or are you not?
No, I'm not exempt, not at all. Just because I know it's there doesn't mean it's not a vaccine. Knowing about autocults is not a defense against autocults. It's almost like saying I know about violence, and so bullets can't hurt me. That you can't take that position. So I'm not exempt at all.
Is there any set of behaviors, or I guess, is there any lifestyles that would further inoculate somebody from engaging in autocults?
We've seen what happens if you over-inoculate. You'll create a super cult. So it's going to be a fine balance. The Stoics are interesting. They are trying to tease the autocult, the shape of the autocult out, in the hopes to then understand its motives. Can a single Stoic do that for 10,000 autocults? Can it do it for 100,000? All you have to do is expand beyond the Dunbar limit. All of a sudden, Stoicism falls apart too. So there's going to have to be some collaborative research element. The individual itself is completely prone to predatory autocults. There's no defense at the individual level. You would have to work as a collective to tease this stuff out and be effectively a permanent researcher just for your own defense. You can also leverage some autocults. Like, for example, it's feasible to steer autocults to attack other autocults. That's going to be marketing of the future. So there will be a need for Stoics to detect behavior of autocults for those marketing advantages.
What do you think Game B broadly gets right, and what do you think it broadly gets wrong?
It understands the epistemic collapse scenario. The problem of understanding it is that you now have to navigate it, and at some point you need force to do that navigation. And I don't know. Well, I can't say I don't know, because there is a model. You had Aristotle. He understood roughly this stuff as well. And his solution to that was to train Alexander. That's how he navigated these problems. So Game B is either going to train an Alexander, or it's going to die to the autocults. So
one of the things that came up in the middle of your talk was, in my mind, the topic of psychedelics, because there's been this increased appetite and funding for psychedelic research. And some people believe that we might be able to create synthetic derivations of psilocybin, for example, to act as further chemical levers to modulate the brain. Do you have any thoughts on this and how this fits into your whole autocult framing?
Yeah, I made reference to the LSD experiments way back in the 60s when this psycho research was at its prime and it was part of military spending formerly. A lot of the drug culture was military funded. That's a sad truth. You can look that one up. But it was trying to further this psychotechnological research. So if we're back there again, that's usually a red flag for me. Why do you need to control the behavior tree so tightly? Have you just formed such a fragile system that you need to control behavior down to that level? I mean, that's a giant red flag in and of itself. But you will get modifications of the behavior tree. That's a well-known, well-studied thing. So I suppose the question then might be, what behavior trees are being selected from this research? Which ones will flourish and which ones will die off?
In the most optimistic scenario, what sort of positive black swans do you hope for, or could
That's
you
next
hope
week. That's next week. That's next week. Where last week I did game A. This week is game B. Next week is game over, which is going to show the positive, the most useful positive outcome I can think of under these conditions.
All right, we're getting some questions populating here, but I have one more for you that's going to sound a little bit oblique, but I wonder if you can riff on this. Where does the idea of love fit into this?
Oh, the determinists will tell you it's all chemicals. I've been hearing that for my entire life. That might, there is, when you look at the cult space-time, and you say, okay, these nodes of excitation are at these levels and so forth, and you're controlling this mass behavioral tree, or you're controlling the behavioral tree of the masses. Love does not provide any type of benefit in terms of defenses against this behavior tree shaping, because it can also be used as part of behavior tree shaping. I mean, you see this with sexual abuse victims. Imprinting is a thing, and then you get down to, like, that's the mechanics of, the mechanics of reproduction, which is associated with love. If the love you're talking about is more like any one of the 6 definitions that the Greeks came up with, they have behavioral tree properties too. We've seen electroshock experimentation where a person will literally fall in love with someone. It's kind of bleak, but it is going to be commoditized just like every other behavior under these conditions, I'm afraid.
The angle that I was thinking of it from was the way in which love can kind of allow people to get over some epistemic conflict. So you might recognize that somebody has a completely different perspective from you. Maybe they're part of a different autocult. But if your autocult, or if the memes that infect your mind point you in the direction of love, or where you are able to practice some kind of unconditional positive regard for the person you're disagreeing with, that often becomes like this liminal point where the autocults no longer bump up against each other as strongly as they could. I wonder if that even makes sense, because I'm not sure I fully represented the autocults there.
The mechanism you're describing is equally as controllable in the sense that we want to merge these autocults together. Well, there you go. You would turn that, whatever that is, on your definition that you use there. And let's say you wanted friction between the autocults. Well, now you just turn it off, and then there you go. So mergers and acquisitions of autocults, maybe? I don't know.
Autocult M&As. All right. I believe Peter Limberg, steward of the Stoa, has a question. Peter, do you want to ask that?
Yes, thank you, Dan. I don't have a question, but I have a question on other people's behalf. A question and a statement. So I shared your PowerPoint with some of the Game B players. And so Jim Rutt has a question. I don't know how relevant it is. And then Jordan Hall has a statement. So Jim Rutt, aren't all cultures what he'd call a super cult? That's his question. And then Jordan Hall, this is completely wrong, but I understand why and how he gets there.
I brought this up to Jordan Hall previously. Before I just mentioned this, I wanted him to chime in, and he made it clear that the proto-frontier rejiggering was ultimately the most important part here to make this kind of happen, to prevent this super cult outcome. Originally, I had stated that this whole thing was Game B's end game, but we had agreed that if you can adjust the proto-frontier, then you can, at the very minimum, buy time to then try and make sense of all this stuff. So regarding Mr. Rutt's comment, are all cultures a super cult? Arguably, the cultures that exist now, yes, they will have followed the tradition of conquering other cultures and thus embracing all of their memes, iconography, behavioral mores. I mean, the Romans were notorious for that. They would march into an area and say, okay, we're going to conquer you, but we don't want to conquer your religion. You just keep doing your religion, and, that's too sticky for us to put our fingers into, and we're going to be walking off anyway, so you just keep your religion, you just give us the resources, and everything's good, right? So that's that's one tactic of forming this loose knit, where this federation of cults, where you're like, okay, we're gonna tap this cult to do this thing and tap this cult to do this thing. Whether that's a super cult, maybe it could under like an emperor, it could be a super cult where it's being directed centrally, yeah. But in the event of, like, say you have a more formal religion, like, I don't know, let's take Islam for example, where you have two very broad schools of thought regarding how it should go, based entirely upon the mythos of the prophets. You have this illusion of a super cult in Islam, but in practice, not really. They've spent a lot of time killing each other, and probably like the past 800 years. So is that a super cult? I don't know, maybe. Is Coca-Cola a super cult? Yeah, for sure. So there are things which already exist as human super cults, which were again achieved via epistemic vaccines. The moment I put my cult into place, I'm going to wipe out all the competitors. You're not allowed to know God above my own, right? So I'm vaccinating you from all these other cults, which is then creating, the super cult, the superbug.
I got a clarification question from Anjan. Anjan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. I think you went a little too quick for me at the super cult part, Pat. So if you wouldn't mind kind of explaining that again, why a super cult happens, and just maybe redefine what an autocult is. I don't think I really quite get that either.
Sure. I'll happy to run through that. An autocult is when you allow a neural network to adjust the behavioral state machine of a population, not an individual, but a population. So if I can get a neural network to not just represent my brain as is, but represent my preferences, represent my biases, represent all these things, the things that I can already explore with already established understandings of psychology. And then what I would say is, now this neural network is now selecting for a specific kind of behavior. That's where we tip over away from the filter bubble and into the autocult. So a filter bubble is selecting primarily for attention and profit, but an autocult is selecting for whatever behavior it wants to select for. And so the super cult is a concept where, just like antibiotics, where if you over apply them, you will wipe out so much bacteria that only that which is capable of surviving survives, and that becomes immune to the antibiotic. So that's a superbug. That's what a superbug is. The same is true when you're dealing with epistemics. If you wipe out all of the variation of memetics that are going on, the only meme that could possibly endure is the one that can survive all the censorship. And that is where the super cult comes from.
Can you provide a modern day example of one of these super cults?
Modern day example of a super cult. The AIs haven't completely done this yet. It's still human steered. That's kind of why they're screwing up. They're not allowing the AIs to pick their own behaviors. So I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't know if that's happening, but wherever automated censorship is being applied, I would keep a very close eye on that, because that's going to give you some insights as to what candidates are actually making it through.
I got a question from Jean-Philippe. Jean-Philippe, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sorry, if you don't mind me asking a quick follow-up. So automation is the central differentiating characteristics. So for example, a very, very biased news channel that also, like, I watch religiously, and it has a filter bubble, and it kind of makes me not like a particular group of people because it keeps biasing my base rate of what that group does. The difference here with the neural network with an autocult is that it's automated, or is that it's granular, or it's all of the above? Like, what's
No, what you're describing is again, it's still attention economics. When you're talking about news, you're intrinsically talking attention economics. And so all of the AIs that are being deployed in this space are all selecting for attention economics. They're not actually selecting for like people who do jumping jacks. They're not promoting that type of behavior. So if you're hating a group, the reason you're hating that group is because someone found out that you hating that group actually improves their economic performance in an attention economic scenario. So that's not an autocult. That's just a filter bubble. Filter bubbles when you start selecting for the entire range of human behavior, not just for like one little snippet for that extra 5 seconds you send writing an angry comment, so that that type of thing.
Isn't that quite the assumption though? Like, you could see a news organization funded, for example, I don't know, making it up, like by the Koch brothers, where the business model could be different because they have different aims here. So maximizing for attention isn't necessarily their economic.
In order to even, assuming that the case where a news organization can decide to say, well, we're going to do whatever we want and pretend that basic economics doesn't apply to us, you might get a short shelf life of that company as it craters into zero profit. Of course, you could do that at any time when you have an activist shareholder situation. But if that company wants to survive, it has to play in the attention economics game.
All right, Jean-Philippe.
All right, so as maybe some of you, I didn't quite understand all of that, but I have a quick question that came to mind while I was hearing you talk, and that is, would it be possible to actually create an autocult that is actually good for those who are part of it and those who interact with them? I know good is a loaded term a little bit, but let's just say positive in general. For if, let's say, a benevolent creator of an autocult were to come along and espouse his beliefs, among those of that are part of the autocult, could it be possible to create an autocult? It seems like there's a negative theme around autocults that I'm not sure if it's intrinsic to the autocult itself.
Yes, at first you will find the most successful autocults will be those that exploit every single possible concept of goodness that could ever be manifested across cultures. You're going to see like, save the baby whale or whatever, and there's going to be an autocult of that, and there's going to be like save, whatever type of thing attracts people in the least aggressive way, in a way that's kind of like low commitment. That's where you kind of start there. Or you just take an already existing mass movement and you just, you automate that even further. You'll want to do the good thing, but economics eventually comes in when the autocults compete for brain space. And they're going to start selecting for all kinds of different combinations of human behavior that just don't make any sense whatsoever. There's not going to be good or evil. There's not going to be morally pure or what feels good. You're gonna, as that thing evolves, you're going to be buying a shoe one day just to protect you from some autocult, so you don't see some wild ass ad, or it sends you gore, or it's trying to extort you or something like that. So once the competition lays in, you're going to see very strange chains of behavior tree modification.
All right.
Next, we have a question from Rachel Haywire.
Oh, I think you're muted. Sorry, still not getting you. Maybe the sound card's different.
All right, well, that's being worked out. There's a question from Jared. Jared, would you like to ask your question?
I'm not hearing you, Jared.
I was just wondering when you said instead of doing the AI, you said they would need to train an Alexander.
Hmm?
I was just wondering, is that referring to like Alexander the Great?
Yes.
And like, because I know like there's a digital Aristotle movement where they're trying to improve education by using that. I was just wondering if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, referring to Alexander the Great.
Okay.
Because when he was one of the very few people who said, I'm going to conquer 200 tribes with 200 different languages and 200 different religions and 200 different cultures, and I'm going to turn this into an empire. That is the first epistemic emperor who has ever existed.
Okay.
And so eventually you're going to have to settle for that tactic if you want to bring reason to the masses.
Yeah. Okay, I just Googled it, and there is a digital Aristotle. It powers schools, so I just wondered.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, we got a popular question from Hannah Robbins. Hannah, would you like to unmute yourself?
So I'm still trying to understand the autocult thing, and the thing that jumps to mind the most to me is current events and how over the last week we've seen a huge sort of mobilization of calls to action towards anti-racism. And so is that an autocult because it's trying to change people's behavior?
So let's start with the first thing. Does it look like epistemic conflict? I would say yes. There's some people who are saying, here's the categorizations of all things that are wrong, and if we just fix these, then we'll get the results we want. And then there's other people with an epistemic conclusion who say otherwise. So is it an epistemic conflict at its heart? Probably. And if we agree to that, then we have to ask the next question. Is it coming from a well-meaning, enlightened dictator who's somehow organizing people? Is it coming from all kinds of organic conclusions where everybody simultaneously decided to say, well, I feel like fighting systemic racism on Tuesday. It just dawned on me to do it at that day. Or are there AIs behind the scenes doing this stuff as well? And how do you know the answer to that? So in order to figure that out, in order to answer whether it is an autocult at play, you need to look at the behavior that's being demonstrated and seeing, could an autocult camouflage as epistemic conflict, which I propose it will always do. And if that's the case, how do we know an autocult is not involved in that stuff? And that's a much harder question.
So autocult is coming from an AI or involving one.
Yeah, I think people are. It's the autocult concept is tough to grok because it is. It's just tough to understand. So let me try again.
Sorry.
No. This is a wild concept, and it's on me to explain it better. Filter bubbles are like the bacteria, and autocults are like the fish, right? They're much more complicated because bacteria is selecting for like, I need food, or I need to stay away from the heat, or I need to stay away from the light. It's real simple, right? Filter bubbles are real simple. They're trying, I need money. That's the purpose of a filter bubble. Now you get some social engineers and try to tinker with that, but they're still tinkering with it within the framework of accumulating money in an attention economy. An autocult is much more robust than a single cell bacteria. It is going to have a complex range of adaptation behavior to say, how do I conquer the most amount of humans without a human guiding me? I need to select for the space that I can observe to get the behavior that I can then command and capture for myself. So it's probably easier to come up with like an evolutionary chain of like from filter bubble to this to this to this to Australopithecine to this to autocult. But autocult is way down the line in terms of the ability to self-select and find a power equilibrium between itself and another autocult competing for the same brain space. So it is going to be AI driven using the morality machine concept, which is a bit prerequisite stuff. I do recommend watching that one if you want to understand what the morality machine is. But the morality machine is designed to modify to then create a behavioral state machine. So the morality machine is here, and it's saying, I need this behavior to keep surviving. It would be like, I need to keep driving. Like if I was saying, like, let me put it in human terms. I'm a human, and I need to drive to work to keep surviving. That's a complex chain of behavior. If I have to get in the car, I have to wash myself, I have to get the fuel, I have to do all these things. It's a very complicated chain of behavior. And I need to engage in this behavior in order for me to keep surviving. The morality machine is engaging in roughly the same approximation. It has to engage in this particular chain of behavior that it has found, has become reliant upon. It now needs to keep enforcing in order to promote its own survival. So it's, I think the key distinction between a filter bubble and an autocult is that an autocult knows it can die, and a filter bubble doesn't. I think if you really want to get down to it, an autocult is aware of its own mortality. And so it is adapting to the mind space to maintain its survival. And it's an AI doing this, basically. So yeah, it's an AI. It's an AI that knows it's going to die and it has to fight other AIs to keep itself alive. Easiest way I can put it.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? Do you think anyone is actively working on this right now?
Yes.
Okay.
One interesting piece of research is the generative adversarial networks, where AIs do die, and you start getting these much more robust results as a result of it.
Thanks, Matt.
Key had a question about brain space. Key, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for going through that. I have to scroll up to find this question, but it was about brain space indeed. Okay, so if this is about competing for brain space, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but if it is, and you mentioned Elon Musk and like the Neuralink technologies and how expansive it is, sure. But would it help, or could it help to create more brain space, so that, you know, like it's not, people aren't being, you mentioned something really weird about like shoes and buying shoes like for things. What is this? Do you experience something like this? I'm bringing in madness because I have a podcast called 4 Degrees of Madness, and that's madness to me, what you just described. So
You should watch the Zappos ads. They were able to, the Zappos ads, they were able to correlate accelerometer and gyroscopic data in the phone to gait and to walking patterns. And if your walking pattern deviated, they concluded that perhaps your shoe was broken. And so that would be an indicator that you need to buy more shoes. So to answer your question about creating more brain space, I would not be surprised if that was an autocult adaptivity, meaning let's create brain space that looks like brains, but it really isn't. So you waste all your resources trying to conquer land that isn't even valuable. So it's feasible that an autocult would most likely create a bunch of fake human brains for the sole purpose of faking out all the other AIs competing for it. So they waste resources on it. So that's an adaptive competitive strategy. Yeah, I can see that happening.
David S., would you like to ask your question about protocols?
Yeah, protocols. What was that? Oh, what was the protocol question? Can you remind me? Where was it?
I just pasted it back in the chat.
Oh, thanks.
Protocols.
Yeah, so that was kind of just looking at autocult. There was something in that that made me think that, oh yeah, there's a lot of latent stuff that is possible in culture. There's a lot of just unexpressed stuff in there. So the AI can sort of play with that and say what gels there, and then just kind of just keep gelling that until it's like, we've got a good cascade here. That's what we want.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's able to pick up the protocol is probably a good thing. A cultural fad or stuff like that. It's picking up on something and it can manifest it almost instantaneously. So bye-bye marketers. See you later.
Hello, can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Hey, I'm sorry about my sound. I'm really just loving this talk. As always, I had a question about like specific occult prototypes. Can you select any user to designate an occult function, Or is that something you would want to test for to make sure that the user would be a good archetype to represent the function of the autocult?
Function. Can you explain what you mean by function?
Well, the functioning of the autocult, if, for example, it's to get a certain idea, a memescape out, a narrative that they want to implant in people's brains, would you want to assign a user that you tested and interviewed, or could you just randomly pick a user and assign them an archetype and make them like your tupla to activate the autocult's programming?
I understand. So let's use the astrology example. So there are archetypes built into astrology. You have your 12 zodiac signs and then your sun stuff and all the other things that the nuance and everything else that exists there. That type of archetype expresses as a category in AI land, and correspondence of categories you can use all the standing tricks of data science today to identify which categories you want to promote and which categories you don't want to promote. Sometimes you can use knockout to say, okay, well, like maybe if we get rid of Taurus from the zodiac, then what type of behavior happens here? So yeah, you can pick and choose and select for that type of correlation, and you can then reinforce that correlation over and over again, but not just for the entire autocult as a singular being, but within its ecosystems of psychotechnology. So it's able to then say, for these scenarios, we want to deploy Taurus, and for these scenarios, we want to deploy Sagittarius.
So would you say that the ones that are deployed, is it okay to just randomly select them and see how they run, like as a user test, or would it be better to just have a pre-arranged selection of users to activate?
Constant testing, which is what the internet is good for. Continuous integration testing.
All right, we are approaching the end of the hour. I think we have time for one more quick question, which I am going to hand to Aria about the butterfly war. Aria, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hey, Pat. Thanks again for doing these.
Yep.
You mentioned that you can use GANs to kill autocults. Is the butterfly war your attempt to strategically kill autocults? And if so, how do you decide which autocults to kill? And I'm going to lump in the last question asked here because it's related to mine is, does the butterfly war mess with AI that will end up creating its own autocults?
This is the second time you jumped to the end, sir. So I would like to publicly acknowledge that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to steer the eugenics of these autocults. That's a short answer, because once these things start rocking, oh man, it's going to be weird. You're going to have very strange formulations of philosophy. You're going to have people rationalizing the correlations they can make about the behavior they're seeing to the best of their knowledge, and it's going to be intrinsically incorrect from at least a factual standpoint, but it might be pragmatically useful. So you can't really throw all of it out. People will adapt to this wild scenario the same way they adapted to the Bronze Age, where you had infinite gods everywhere, and they were walking amongst you, and they were there. And instead of your gods constantly fighting all the time, you would just say, "Oh, well, that was Zeus and Odin at the same time doing their thing," right? So we've already experienced what it's like to have different drivers of complex behavior operating at the same time in the same space. It becomes epistemically very mushy. Because especially when you say, oh, well, the creation myth of the Jewish God is nowhere near similar to the creation myth of the Viking God. And then you have to resolve all that stuff, and you're spending all your neural extra space resolving this conflict so that you can then navigate the culture that it represents. So we know how to do that. We've been doing that for a long time, and we most likely slip back into this, and it's going to obviously drive a need for Game B to navigate that epistemics until you get your epistemic emperor a la Alexander. But in terms of shaping the AIs, I would like to target them and shape them in a very specific sequence of behaviors, which is what Game Over is all about. And yes, Butterfly War is part of that.
follow up in your Aristotle Alexander framing. Are you Aristotle or Alexander?
I'm Thales. I'm way back. Like I'm way before any of this stuff. So if there's an Alexander, I don't even know it's going to be a human. I don't even know. I'm rarely the hero in my own mythology. So I'm just trying to see where the cascade is probably going to go, and just be like, just do this tiny action here, and it'll matter 300 years later. It's the best I can do at this time.
All right. On that note, thank you so much for another session of the Dark Stoa, Pat. We look forward to next week's on, I guess, Game Over.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to be the culmination of everything?
That'll be the end of season 1.
End of season 1. All right. Season finale. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for your participation. Thanks for all the great questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. I'm just going to pass it over to Peter as he mentions a couple events at the Stoa.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Pat, for another adventurous talk. The Dark Stoa. So tomorrow at Daniel's Metagame Mastermind event, that's at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be delivering a PowerPoint presentation, brushing off my PowerPoint game, and talking about the Stoic Hustle, which is a new psychotechnology that I'll release there. So check that out. And Tyson, our boy Tyson, are you still in the chat? If you're presentable, do you want to talk about your event right after that one?
Cool. Yeah, I'm here. The event every Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time is Flowing with Unknowingness. So we explore freestyle, spoken word, and rap to deepen our embrace of uncertainty through creative self-expression, and aiming toward an experience of group flow or sort of dialogical jazz through freestyle, and just really experimenting with it. And it's been a really good way for me to get to know people here in just a really fun space. So it's a playground for self-expression, and I look forward to seeing you all there.
Yeah, if you want to build a really good relationship with unknowingness, that's a place to be. And you also feel like a fucking idiot, which is delicious. And then tomorrow on Sunday at what time is it? Yeah, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, we're experimenting with a new psychotechnology with Rebecca Fox. It's called Trapple Perilous, which is what Robert Anton Wilson talks about. So this is just a copy. Is a place where we train ourselves to dissolve the barriers between us and them, to think flexibly about our identities, and to get comfortable with uncertainty. We use playful exercise drawn from Socratic dialogue, meditative practice, and occultism, and hopefully emerge as radical agnostics capable of bearing witness to our own personal crisis of meaning. Hot. Okay, so you can RSVP on the website for that, thestoa.ca, and check out our gift economy. All the facilitators now are on this, so if you like Daniel's emceeing as much as I do, and you enjoy his Armenian chest hair, just go to that website and you can send him a gift directly. All right. Okay, we gotta laugh at him. Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks, folks.